Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event on the topic Truth, Justice, and America's Aging Workforce with our guest speaker, Dr. Beth Truesdale. Our event this evening is part of a fall series of events at St. Olaf College on the larger theme of discrimination and the search for justice and truth. This is the third event in that series. My name is Edmund Santuri. I'm professor of religion and philosophy at St. Olaf College and Morrison Family Director of the Institute for Freedom and Community, the institute sponsoring our event this evening and the fall series just mentioned. The purpose of St. Olaf's Institute for Freedom and Community is to stimulate and encourage free inquiry and meaningful debate of important political and social issues among students, faculty, staff, and the larger public. By exploring diverse ideas about politics, markets, and society, the Institute aims to challenge presuppositions, question easy or comfortable answers, and foster constructive civil dialogue among those with differing values and contending points of view. For help in organizing our event tonight, very special thanks go to the excellent staff of the Institute, Assistant Director Tanya Charlotte Paley, from whom you've just heard, and Administrative Assistant Dawn Bartz. The Institute events could not happen without their substantial contributions. Thanks also to Molly Work and Carrie Vanderveen of St. Olaf Marketing and Communications, and to Jeff O'Donnell and the Broadcast Media Services crew for their work. Thanks also to St. Olaf students for helping us this evening: Emily Albrecht, A.D. Bantz, Phoebe Carey, Melissa Nakusi. Thanks to the faculty and students of St. Olaf Public Affairs Conversation Program, the Nursing Program, and the Social Work Program for their integration of this event in their study. Finally, thanks to Judy Ryan, a St. Olaf alum, one-time regent of the college, and a significant figure in the nursing world, whose generous gift to the Institute supports our program tonight. I'm especially delighted to introduce our guest speaker this evening, Beth Truesdale, a sociologist, a researcher at Harvard Center for Population and Development Studies, and an expert on economic inequality, labor markets, health, aging, and public policy. Those identifications are enough to generate a high degree of interest in Beth's being here tonight. But enhancing this interest are the facts that Beth is also a 1997 graduate of St. Olaf College, where she was a participant in the college's Great Conversation Program, Global Semester, and the St. Olaf Choir, a double major in chemistry and English, and as a St. Olaf student, a winner of a Rhodes Scholarship. She is one of 9 Rhodes Scholars in the college's history. With that Rhodes Scholarship, she earned at Oxford University a BA in English and History and an MA in Theology. Having completed her studies at Oxford, Beth settled with her family in London and worked with a startup communication firm that got her interested in the relation between evidence-based research and public policy. Eventually, she saw that such research was the business of social science and decided then to do graduate work in sociology. She earned her PhD in sociology from Harvard in 2017 and is now, as I already mentioned, a researcher with the Harvard Center for Population and Development Studies. As part of her work at the Harvard Center, Beth is co-editing a volume entitled Overtime: America's Aging Workforce and the Future of Working Longer. Her presentation tonight is related to the work of this projected volume. Among other things, Beth is concerned with identifying and analyzing inequities in opportunities for aging Americans to work longer in life. As she puts it in a published interview she did recently with Institute Assistant Director Tanya Charlotte Paley, and I quote, "The issues with work and aging map onto existing inequalities in our society. College graduates are much more likely to work longer than people with less education, for instance, because highly educated people tend to have fewer health problems and more stable jobs," end of quotation. Beth is also interested in the matter of ageism as another form of discrimination in the workplace. Beth's research raises a number of important questions about what justice requires given certain empirical truths about inequality, work, and aging in our society. and thus her presentation tonight is an important moment in our lecture series on discrimination and the search for truth and justice. We're excited to have Beth with us again. Would you please join me in welcoming Beth Truesdale on Truth, Justice, and America's Aging Workforce.
Well, thanks to Ed for that very generous introduction. I'm so very pleased to be here. I had a wonderful time as a student at St. Olaf, and it's a real pleasure to have a chance to be back here and to share a little bit about my research with you. So I want to start tonight by asking you to imagine a pyramid, broad at the bottom, getting narrower toward the top. This is the age distribution of a society. At the bottom are the very large number of infants. In each age group, as you go up, the pyramid narrows until at the top we have the very small number of very old adults. For 2 million years, give or take, the age distribution of pretty much every human society on the planet took this shape. Lots of babies, a medium number of young adults, and a small number of older adults. And then about 100 years ago, something began to change. Public and private efforts came together. Governments successfully harnessed markets, and the result was massive and unprecedented improvements, not only in health, but also in education and in standards of living. In the US and around the world, mortality rates fell. Generation on generation, infants were more likely to survive into adulthood. Adults were more likely to survive into old age. Families began to expect their infants to survive, and so they started having fewer babies. As life expectancy rises and birth rates fall, societies age. The age distribution that we have now is no longer a pyramid. It's more like a pillar, with roughly the same number of older adults as children. This is the age distribution now for the US and for the world as a whole. Now, I really can't overstate how radical this transformation from pyramid to pillar is. As a society ages, it changes everything. It changes how we work, it changes family dynamics, it changes the way that our cities need to be set up. It changes healthcare, our politics. And what's important is that it affects not only those people who are themselves older. An aging society affects everybody. But societies often don't recognize exactly how radical this transformation is. It's a major opportunity, but our institutions don't always respond with the investments that are needed. Our aging society could be a real cause for celebration. But like any big change, it also brings challenges. For individuals, there's the challenge of income for more years of life. For societies, there's the need to fund social insurance programs, like Social Security and Medicare. Working longer is one possible solution to both of those problems. The average age of retirement in the US is about 63. So what if people just stayed employed for more years? For individuals, working longer should produce more financial security in retirement. Work also provides social engagement. It can be good for people's health. For societies, more workers paying taxes and social insurance contributions should benefit the public purse. And so in the US and in many industrialized nations, policymakers have embraced the notion that most individuals can and should work longer. Sounds like a reasonable solution. In the US, over the past 70 years, older Americans are living not only longer but also healthier lives. They have more education. Many jobs are less physically demanding. All of these things should make it easier for more Americans to work longer. So what's the problem? Well, I want to argue that at least two things deserve a closer look. The first is that averages only tell you so much. There are major inequalities in America's aging workforce that reflect the deep inequalities in American society as a whole. These are inequalities by race, by gender, whether you're married or not, where you live. And maybe most important for working longer is how much education you have and what kind of a job that means you're able to secure. The bottom line is that working longer may be a good fit for some, but it's not a good fit for everyone. The second thing that deserves a closer look is changes across cohorts. The outlook is considerably less rosy for the cohorts that are now in middle age than for the cohorts that are now at retirement age. Working longer may be difficult for a growing proportion of Americans. I'm going to argue that if we want to make working longer a good possibility for more Americans, we as a society need to be making investments that improve people's lives when they're young and middle-aged. Let me give you a little bit of a roadmap of where we're headed tonight. First of all, I'm going to outline the argument in favor of working longer. Then I'm going to talk about three domains that are really important for working longer. I'm going to talk a lot about jobs, talk a medium amount about health, and a very little about family dynamics. And then I'll conclude with a few suggestions about the way forward. Now, this is a talk about work and aging. We're all aging, but quite a lot of this audience is pretty young. So for those of you who are, the first question might be, does this really apply to us? And I'd like to convince you that it does. I'd like to appeal to both your altruism and your self-interest. First, I want to argue that this applies to you if you aspire to live in a just society where everyone has a chance to flourish. Second, that many things that make working longer feasible and attractive for older workers are also things that benefit Americans of all ages. And third, if you're lucky, you will someday be an older worker yourself. So you have a vested interest in seeing changes made now that will benefit you in years to come. So, why working longer? Where did the idea of working longer come from, and why has it proved so popular among policymakers? Let's take a little foray into history. There are many risks that vanishingly few individuals can afford to bear on their own. These are things like massive medical bills, disability, and poverty in old age. After the Great Depression in the 1930s and the 1940s, political and business leaders in the U.S. built a whole host of new institutions to spread and to manage these risks. Other industrialized nations did the same. This was the invention of social insurance. Today, two of our major social insurance programs are Social Security and Medicare, which provide a basic income and medical care for older adults. Social insurance is hugely practical. When governments require everyone to pay into a social insurance system, individual costs are very low. Social insurance is also based on fundamental values. It acknowledges that we're all in this together. Catastrophic risks are beyond individual control, but they can be pooled and they can be managed. At about the same time in history, employers began to offer defined benefit pensions. Governments supported these through the tax code. A defined benefit pension is an annuity. It's a guaranteed income when you retire. And part of what's important is that employers bore the risk of investing the funds and managing the ups and downs in the stock market. So through both public and private efforts, poverty rates in old age dived. During about the past 30 years, however, things have changed. Political and corporate leaders have been dismantling the social insurance system in the US, turning shared economic risks into individual risks. The framing of retirement, the way we talk about it, has changed. Rather than retirement security being a shared problem that requires collective action, retirement security is now usually framed as a personal problem that requires personal solutions. Employers have cut costs by ending DB pension schemes. For us upcoming generations, DB pensions are a thing of the past. Individual savings do nothing like enough to compensate for the lack of guaranteed pensions. And this is perhaps not surprising when you consider that median incomes have been pretty much flat, while the costs of education and housing and healthcare have increased. What we have left is Social Security. Now, Social Security benefits are quite modest because Social Security was never designed to pay entirely for retirement. The average Social Security benefit is about $16,000 a year. For a lot of older Americans, though, Social Security is their main or their only source of income. Overall, the vast majority of Americans are in a system that puts the burden on individuals to prepare for their own retirement, but doesn't give them the resources to be able to do so. So this is the backdrop: decreasing retirement security. Working longer, which is an individual solution, starts to look pretty good. You can start claiming Social Security benefits as early as age 62. But every year that you wait to claim Social Security, up to age 70, your monthly check grows. Somebody who'd get about $16,000 a year from Social Security if they retire at age 62 will end up with about $30,000 a year if they put off claiming and retire at age 70. So delaying Social Security is, for most people, the single most powerful thing that they can do to improve their financial security in retirement. So why don't we all just work longer? Well, there are three domains that we need to think about that are especially important for people's ability and desire to work longer. And those are jobs, health, and family. Things may be getting worse for upcoming cohorts in ways that make it harder for people to work longer. And this is true especially for lower income and less educated groups in upcoming cohorts. But there are some worrying trends among those with advantages as well. So let's start with jobs. The working longer policy solution has some assumptions baked into it. One is that the assumption that most people are working in the run-up to retirement ages, so they just have to be persuaded to keep on working for a few more years. But this leaves out a very large proportion of Americans who are already out of the labor force in their 50s. Last year, 2018, among adults ages 55 to 59, the unemployment rate was less than 3%. That's very low. But it sets aside more than a quarter of adults ages 55 to 59 who were out of the labor force, meaning that they were not employed and not actively looking for employment. People who are out of the labor force in their 50s are unlikely to be candidates for working longer into their 60s or 70s. And this suggests that we need to look at what's happening earlier in people's lives. Working longer depends both on the ability and desire of workers to keep on working and on employers. If you want to carry on working longer, you have to have a job that makes it possible. But across the board, jobs are becoming less stable and less secure. During the past 30 years, we've seen a fundamental restructuring of employment in many parts of the U.S. economy. One word for this is fissuring. Firms split off functions that were once managed internally. So in the middle of the 20th century, a large firm would have employed a very wide spectrum of different kinds of workers. A hotel chain, for example, would employ managers, receptionists, accountants, publicists, housekeepers, chefs, groundskeepers, and many more. But in recent decades, major companies have faced increasing pressure to deliver ever larger returns to investors. And one of the ways that they've responded to this pressure has been to focus on core competencies, which are the most profitable, and to shed activities that are less profitable. So these non-core activities get shifted to separate smaller companies who may in turn hire even smaller businesses to do the work. You can imagine what this does to a workplace structure. Each level of the fissured workplace structure requires a return on their work. So the further down you go, the greater the incentives to cut corners. And the results are lower wages, fewer benefits, and greater risks to health and safety. Our employment relationships are increasingly complicated, and our laws and regulations just haven't kept up. One concern is that industries where fissuring is common are some of the fastest growing in the U.S. economy, especially the service sector. The quality of jobs has declined substantially, especially for workers without a college degree. Many low-wage jobs also have low-quality schedules. Technology has made it possible for employers to do what's called just-in-time scheduling. So in some sectors like retail and hospitality and food service, it's very common for workers to get their schedules at the last minute, to have wages that vary wildly from week to week, to be scheduled for a shift and then sent home without pay if they're not needed, to be on call without any additional pay, to be scheduled for split shifts, and to be scheduled for what's called clopening, meaning they have to work till a late closing on a late shift and then work an opening shift early the next morning. As you can imagine, these kinds of schedules are bad for people's health, they're bad for their finances, and they're bad for their families. And usually when we talk about the effects of these unpredictable and non-standard schedules on workers, we think about younger workers and their families. But we should also think about what these kinds of jobs mean for working longer. If clopening is hard when you're 25, it's surely not going to be easier when you're 65. So those of us here, if you have a college degree, are you immune from the decline in job quality? Unfortunately not. Fissuring is much more common in jobs that don't require a college degree, but it's spreading higher up the economic ladder. So now you see very commonly jobs like IT help desks, computer programmers, and legal researchers are split off from the firms in which they were once embedded. Job stability is also worse toward the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, but job stability is also an issue all the way up. Let me give you an illustration. When you look at data on Americans in their 50s, about half of Americans in their early 50s have what we might call career jobs, full-time, full year, with a long-term employer. These folks are the lucky ones. They have the jobs that are the most stable. Among those who have career jobs in their early 50s, more than half later experienced what economists call an employer-related involuntary job separation, which just means that they weren't fired and they didn't quit, they were laid off. More than half, and those are the ones with the stable jobs, the lucky ones. If you're one of those folks, there are often major consequences to being laid off in your 50s. People who lose a job in their 50s often struggle to find a job and end up being effectively forced to retire earlier than they would wish. Those who do find a new job rarely find one that's as good as the job that they lost. Of these workers in this particular study, only 1 in 10 of these workers who experienced an involuntary job separation in their 50s ever earned as much after their separation as before. So, having a job that makes it possible for you to work longer is an issue even for those who start off with all the advantages. point, high quality, stable jobs in middle age are the main precursor to working at older ages, but stable jobs are becoming more rare. Age discrimination also makes it hard to work longer. It's illegal to discriminate against anyone ages 40 or older on the basis of age, and it has been since 1967, but it's clearly very common. You can't legally set an explicit age limit in a job post, but employers often advertise for job applicants with, for example, no more than 5 years' experience, which effectively excludes many older workers. You can't legally dismiss older employees on account of age, but employers may cut costs by getting rid of employees who are paid more because they have more seniority and who are also older. Like other types of discrimination, age discrimination can be very hard to prove. If you send in a resume and you don't hear back, is it because of your age or because of something else? The gold standard for research on discrimination in hiring is called an audit study. Researchers send out pairs of resumes that are as identical as possible, but differ only on the characteristic that you're interested in this case, age. Some economists recently did an audit study using 40,000 resumes that were made to look as if applicants were either 30 years old, 50 years old, or 65 years old. 19% of the younger resumes got callbacks. 15% of the middle-aged resumes got callbacks. Only 12% of the older resumes got callbacks. An audit study like this is the most direct evidence that we have that age discrimination is very real. One major reason for age discrimination, especially in customer-facing roles, is what sociologists call aesthetic labor. That is, employees are hired or promoted or retained in part because their physical appearance matches the brand. So servers in a restaurant may be expected not only to be friendly to customers and to be skilled at serving the meal, but also to look the part. And in many cases, looking the part means looking young. Discrimination on the basis of appearance tends to be worse for women than for men. It also starts at a younger age than you might think. A sociologist who recently wrote a book about aging in the restaurant industry interviewed one woman who had been told at age 33 that she was too old to be a bartender. This kind of age discrimination is not subtle. In 2011, a lawsuit against the restaurant chain Texas Roadhouse brought many of their hiring practices to light. On job applications, company officials had posted yellow stickers with comments like old and chubby, little older lady, and middle age doesn't really fit our image. Fewer than 2% of Texas Roadhouse's hires for front-of-house jobs were people over the age of 40. And in a series of court cases since the early 1990s, courts have actually made it easier for companies to discriminate against older employees. Recently, there was a particularly striking case involving the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, which had two sets of guidelines for hiring sales managers. In the first set of guidelines, under the heading Targeted Candidate, the R.J. Reynolds guidelines said 2 to 3 years out of college. Under the heading Stay Away From were applicants in sales for 8 to 10 years. In the second set of guidelines, Targeted said candidates ages 35 and under, and under Stay Away From, it said candidates ages 35 and over. Of more than 1,000 sales managers that Reynolds hired, only 19 were older than 40. It's kind of hard to imagine what additional evidence you'd want of age discrimination in hiring. But the tobacco company argued that important parts of the age discrimination law don't protect job applicants, they only protect employees. And the lower courts accepted these arguments, and when the case reached the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court let the decision stand. Let me sum up this discussion about jobs. For many workers, the workplace is becoming a more challenging place to earn a living. The situation is worse for workers without college degrees, but those with college degrees are not immune from either fissured employment or age discrimination. For many, the quality and stability of jobs have decreased over the past 30 years, and the courts have made it easier for companies to discriminate on the basis of age. Jobs are changing in ways that may make it harder to work longer. Let's turn now to the second domain that's important for working longer, health. Poor health is one of the main reasons that people retire earlier than they planned. Today's retirees are healthier and living longer than any prior generation. But by several measures, the next generation, and especially those with less education and lower incomes, are not doing as well. First, let's think about life expectancy. In the U.S., people's average lifespans have increased every year since records began in the late 19th century. That is an extraordinary achievement. But life expectancy is very different across income and education. 40-year-old men with incomes in the top quartile, that's the top 25%, can expect to live to about age 87. 40-year-old men with incomes in the bottom quartile can expect to live to about age 77, a gap of 10 years of life. And there's a similar gap among women. There are inequalities in health by socioeconomic status, by almost every measure of health, and in almost every time and place for which we have data. People who are lower on the socioeconomic ladder are less likely to have the health that they need to work longer than are people who are higher up the socioeconomic ladder. Now, the size and the persistence of inequalities in health is worrying in itself, but we add to that another concern, which is that over the past 3 decades, inequalities in health and longevity have increased in the U.S. Life expectancy has increased quite a lot for those toward the top of the socioeconomic scale. It has increased much less, and by some measures has gotten worse for those toward the bottom of the socioeconomic scale. We see worrying trends now among middle-aged adults in self-reported health, obesity, diabetes, mental distress, depression, suicide, and substance use, especially among Americans without college degrees. Now, these sources of poor health are a cause for concern in themselves. They're also major causes of work disability. Now, it's easy when we start talking about health to start blaming individuals for their poor behavior. And of course, we all make choices that have consequences for our mental and physical health, for better and sometimes for worse. But that approach sets aside the contexts in which people make decisions. Anybody who has ever found that they make different choices when eating in a college cafeteria and when eating at home knows that context is important. You can no doubt think of many aspects of context in the environment that affect people's health. I want to mention just one, which is called scarcity. What happens to our decisions when we have too little of something? When we have too little of something, whether that something is time or food or money, we get worse at self-control and long-term planning. You know this feeling every time you have an essay deadline. Deadlines are very useful. They increase your motivation and concentration, and as a result, you'll probably finish the essay on time. But there's a cost to that increased attention. You have less brain space for making good decisions about anything else. Social scientists call it a bandwidth tax. Anything that is not the essay gets shortchanged or put off. You might also be more likely to eat that extra slice of pizza or that 10th Oreo. You pay later for scarcity now. Interestingly, even very modest amounts of cognitive scarcity lead to worse health behavior. Psychologists have done some very clever experiments to show how this happens. In one study, subjects were asked to memorize either long strings of numbers or just a couple of digits. Then subjects were offered the choice of a healthy snack or something sweet. Those who had to memorize long strings of numbers were more likely to take the sweets than those whose cognitive bandwidth wasn't so occupied. So, whatever increases feelings of scarcity is likely to lead to bad decisions. We just talked about job quality and insecurity. If you're rushing from one shift to the next or working odd hours, it's hard to get the sleep you need. It's hard to get exercise. It's hard to cook healthy meals even if you have the money to buy nutritious food. And then if you're also worried about making ends meet or about losing your job, those worries take up more brain space, and they make it much harder to make good long-term decisions. And so you get feedback loops. Unequal jobs and unequal environment are related to unequal health. And unequal health, in turn, leads to inequalities in working. Add to that upcoming cohorts are less healthy than today's retirees, and that may affect their ability to work longer. Finally, let me talk about changes in family dynamics. As longevity increases, more middle-aged workers have elderly parents who need care. About half of Americans who reach age 65 will eventually develop a disability serious enough to require long-term care. I'm going to repeat that because I think it's one of the most remarkable facts, that about half of Americans who reach age 65 will eventually require long-term care. As a society, we are totally failing to reckon with this reality. Long-term care is eye-wateringly expensive. The cost of a year in a nursing home is on the order of $80,000 to $100,000. Even part-time home help can rapidly run into tens of thousands of dollars a year. Medicare doesn't pay for long-term care. Medicaid does pay for long-term care, but only for people with very low incomes and essentially no cash savings. So in many cases, the responsibility of caring for parents falls on their adult children. More than 20% of men and women ages 55 to 64 are providing some form of elder care. Women are more likely to provide care than men, especially with assistance with daily tasks like dressing and bathing and eating. When men provide care, often they're doing things like helping with errands or fixing things around the house. Now, in a sense, having elderly parents to care for is a real privilege. Because people who are higher up the socioeconomic ladder tend to live longer, and people tend to pass their socioeconomic status to their kids, college graduates are more likely than those without college degrees to have elderly parents at all. And in some cases, the children who are providing care enjoy it and find it really meaningful to be able to help their parent, usually their mother. But caregiving can also be extremely stressful, and it can affect work, especially for people who have little job flexibility. Here, of course, we run into the inequalities again. In many professional jobs, there's a certain amount of flexibility on the employee's side. You can come in a bit late or leave a bit early, and as long as you get the work done, nobody minds too much when you get it done. But in many low-wage jobs, the flexibility is all on the employer's side, and the employee has little control over their hours. Increasing life expectancy means that there are more elderly people who will need care. But you remember that there's a second part to the aging societies, and that's falling birth rates. Falling birth rates means that there are fewer family members to share the care of parents. People who have fewer siblings, and especially people who have fewer sisters, are more likely to be providing care. The bottom line here is that population aging changes family dynamics, and not necessarily in ways that are likely to support working longer. So let me recap. You've heard a little bit about how unprecedented aging societies are in the history of the world. You've stayed with me through hearing about social insurance and financial insecurity in retirement. You've heard about the very large and persistent inequalities in health, in family, and in jobs within cohorts, and about how those things may be worse for the cohorts now in middle age and younger than for the people currently in retirement. So what can be done about it? The bad news is that there is no single magic bullet. But the good news is that there is a lot that we as a society could choose to do. To my mind, there are two main questions that we should be asking. First, how can we support a decent standard of retirement for everyone? And second, what investments do we need to make in younger and middle-aged workers so that they become in a better position to work at older ages? There are many reasonable answers to both of these questions, and I'm going to offer just one of each. First, to the question about how we support a decent standard of retirement for everyone. Strengthen Social Security. Proponents of working longer sometimes suggest raising the Social Security retirement age even further, from 67 to age 70, or raising the earliest age at which you can claim reduced benefits from age 62 to 63 or older. Now, any increase in the retirement age essentially amounts to an across-the-board cut in benefits. For those who want to work longer, because their jobs and their health and their family situation makes that a good option, a higher retirement age might not hurt too much. But because people without college degrees are less likely to be in a position to work at older ages than people with college degrees, raising the retirement age is likely to increase inequalities in health and financial well-being among older people. There are a lot of other ways to strengthen Social Security. Social Security, along with Medicare, is wildly popular among Americans all across the political spectrum because it works so well. There's a lot of unintended confusion and also a fair amount of deliberate misinformation about Social Security's financial situation. First of all, Social Security is not in crisis. Here's how the system works. The benefits that are being paid to retirees today are paid mostly by the payroll taxes that are being paid by today's workers. Now, for more than 3 decades, Social Security collected more in income than it paid in benefits, and that surplus has been invested in trust funds. Now that the shape of that population pyramid is changing to a pillar, and there's fewer people of working age paying in compared to the number of people who are retired, the bulk of benefits are still paid by payroll taxes from current workers, and Social Security is starting to use the trust fund to make up the difference between income and costs. This is not a surprise. We've seen the consequences of population aging coming down the pipeline for a long time. The Social Security Trust Fund is currently projected to last until the mid-2030s. What happens then? There's a common misunderstanding that Social Security benefits would stop entirely. That is not the case. If Congress does nothing to strengthen Social Security in the next 15 years, Social Security will still be able to pay about 80% of its promised benefits using the annual income from taxes. But while nobody knows what the future will bring, least of all in politics, the chances are very good that Congress will act. And they have lots of options for change. Raising the retirement age is only one among many. There are other options that would increase Social Security's income to close the funding gap or even to expand Social Security. One option is that we could lift the Social Security cap. Now, what's the Social Security cap, you ask? Well, Social Security taxes are only paid on the first $133,000 of wages. So if you earn $1 million a year, you don't pay any additional Social Security taxes on the other $867,000. If the very rich paid the same percentage of their income in payroll tax as everybody else, it would nearly close the funding gap on its own. And there are many other policies that are proposals and possibilities, some that would increase Social Security revenues, some that would change benefits. Ultimately, for me, the point is that Social Security is the absolute backbone of financial security in retirement in the U.S. It's the main way that we as a society insure against poverty in old age, recognizing that we want to live in a society where everyone can afford a decent retirement. We can strengthen Social Security, and we should do so. Second, on investments. What investments do we need to make to support an aging society? Again, there are many possible answers, and I just want to focus on one. To help people work longer, we need to improve the quality of jobs for younger and middle-aged workers. One of the things I've been surprised to learn during this research is that almost all U.S. residents work for pay at some point in their lives. We used data from a large survey on health and retirement and looked at people who had never worked during their 50s. We were surprised to see that the majority of people who were out of the labor force in their 50s, this is true of women as well as men, had worked at some point in the last 10 or 15 years. Some sort of work experience was not too far in the past. To me, this suggests that we currently have a lot of missed opportunities to help people remain in the labor force or to return after an injury or an illness. You may have heard of universal design. This is an idea that comes from architecture and product design, and the classic example is a ramp from a sidewalk to the street instead of having a curb. Everybody can use the ramp, but it's particularly valuable for people who are pushing strollers or using wheelchairs. And I think there's an analogy in this conversation about work and working longer. The types of work conditions that make jobs attractive to older workers also, very frequently, make jobs attractive to younger workers. These are things like adequate pay, predictable schedules, flexibility that applies to employees as well as to employers, and supportive colleagues and bosses, and a sense that your work has meaning and value. I'd argue that we need policies that target the quality of work across the board even more than we need policies that target older workers specifically, even when we're really thinking about how to promote work at older ages. Making work more sustainable and secure could increase rates of labor force participation in middle age, especially among those with less than a college degree. And then, higher rates of steady employment in middle age set the stage for higher rates of employment at older ages. Our federal and state laws regulating employment were developed in the middle of the 20th century when the relationship between employees and employers was much more straightforward. Fissured working arrangements have been increasingly common for years, but they're often really well hidden from consumers. Now, recently, the gig economy, companies like Uber or Lyft or Instacart, has brought new attention to these types of arrangements. And there's much more public attention to the costs of failing to update our laws to match these new and more complicated employment relationships. I see that public awareness as a really good thing because it creates demands for governments to take action. At the moment, a lot of the creative policy action is happening at the state level rather than the federal level. Governments are in some sense playing catch-up with corporations. But ironically, because we're so far behind, there's a smorgasbord of options for progress. So let me conclude. We have seen, in the last 100 years, a radical change in the age distribution from pyramid to pillar. We who are alive right now have the great good fortune to be living in an aging society. Over the past 100 years, America and other developed nations have come to enjoy a level of prosperity and health and longevity that is unprecedented in the history of the world. Aging societies present a host of new opportunities, but our institutions need to respond to those changes in productive ways. The U.S. has fallen behind on the investments that we need, and the result is large and persistent inequalities in who's well-placed to work longer and who isn't, and things may be getting worse for upcoming generations. I think there are really two separate conversations here that we need to bring together. On the one side are conversations about the opportunities and challenges that go with aging societies. On the other are conversations about wider investments in society, such as education, health, fair working conditions, and support for families. When people are healthier throughout their lives and when their jobs are steady and secure, not only can they do a better job of supporting their families and their communities as young and middle-aged adults, but they're also likely to be better placed to work longer and to retire with financial security. Then our aging societies really do become a cause for celebration. Thank you.
So we're ready to take some questions, and I have a couple students here with microphones. So if you have a question, raise your hand, they'll come and find you.
Hi, my name's Ian. Thank you so much for coming here. I really enjoyed your talk. I was wondering about an issue that sort of runs parallel with the issues that you brought up, and that's sort of the issue of automation. And I was wondering about how you were thinking through how some of those issues might relate to what you were talking about, and also sort of somewhat related to that, do you think that universal basic income is kind of a policy that could remedy some of the issues that you're speaking to as well?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, automation and technology, and along with that goes globalization and other things that really change the way that the workforce is set up. Yeah, I think those are hugely important, but especially in the case of automation, we don't really have a very good handle on exactly what's likely to happen. I think there's a really terrific report I read recently that said the robots are coming, but slowly. And I think that's probably about right. So there are really two sides when people argue about this, tends to be economists. There are the people who say, we've had massive technological revolutions before, and yet we still have employment, and there's been no point at which technology has displaced workers in the way that we thought it was going to happen. This is no different. And then there are people who say, no, this is different. And this is different because in the past, robots have often been complements to workers. Workers are able to work alongside the robots. They need to program the robots. They need to check the robots' work. Now it's not so much about the robots, it's about the software. And the software is ever so much smarter and can do things like play Go and things that we, until very recently, thought that we were a long way from having computers that are going to be able to do. So I think, there's an argument to be made that it's not the robots, it's the software, which doesn't answer your question about what do we think that's going to do to employment. I think there's certainly, even if we believe that there's not going to be massive numbers of jobs lost in total, there's certainly going to be changes that are painful for people in individual industries as robots or software comes through. And so if you have people being displaced, you know, in your industry, software comes through and can do the job that you used to do better and faster and more accurately than you can, and you lose your job, there may not be a lot of compensation for you in the thought that, well, there's other jobs opening up elsewhere in the economy, because those might not be jobs that are available to you. So we're going to really need to take much more seriously job training and retraining and reskilling in a way that I think we have not done as well as we need to do on that. You asked about universal basic income. It's an interesting idea, and I think there's really lots of ways to achieve what universal basic income aims to achieve, which is to set a floor under what we think is socially acceptable for people to live on. You know, there are many other nations where that floor is set a lot higher than it is in the US. And that's not necessarily with a universal basic income kind of program, but with other forms of safety net. So I think you can achieve the same goal, which is to say, we live in a society that is so rich that people should not be hungry at a fundamental level. And then we might have goals that go up from that. There are many programs that we can use to try to achieve that kind of a goal. Now, universal basic income, we do have some good examples like Alaska, where this is actually the way that it works. And if you live in Alaska, you get paid by the government a check that comes from the state's oil wealth. So it can be done, and it's hugely popular. And it's not as crazy an idea, I think, as you might think on first blush.
Thank you for coming to speak to us. My name is Maxwell, and could you explain some of the reasoning behind lower courts' decisions to allow age discrimination to persist?
That's a terrific question. I have no insight into the mind of the judges who are taking those decisions. Many of the judges who are taking those decisions are conservative appointees, so there is a political lens that you can view this through. I think what's really interesting is that it's part of a much broader program that wants to put more burden on individuals to bear the risks of all sorts of things in society. So, for example, unemployment spells are longer than they used to be, and yet unemployment insurance still runs out when it always did. So there are broader trends here, I think, that the court decisions are part of. And the court decisions, it's not just the one that I mentioned, the R.J. Reynolds case, which I think is particularly interesting. In 2009, there was a Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court basically set a different level of proof for age discrimination cases than for other types of discrimination. Since the laws were made in the 1960s, there was essentially a sort of parallel structure between the civil rights laws that protect people on the basis of race and gender and religion and age discrimination laws. But that's been uncoupled so that the burden of proof in age discrimination cases is that you should be able, I think, to say that, to show that age discrimination is the only reason that somebody has been unfairly treated. And that is a level of proof that's almost impossible to achieve.
Hi, I was wondering if you have any idea whether the issues mental and physical health issues that affect workers who are not college educated or have lower tier jobs, can also affect very highly educated workers in like the medical field or very stressful jobs?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think one way to think about that question is, do we think that jobs are getting worse for college-educated people, as well as the ways in which jobs are getting worse for people without college degrees? And do we expect that that would harm the health of people with college degrees in the same way? Is that a fair reframing of your question? Okay. So here's where an international perspective is actually really helpful. In the middle of the 20th century, the US was the leader in like pretty much anything that you want to look at in science, in education, in health and longevity, in health care. And it's really interesting to see the graphs of like longevity over time across countries, because the US starts off right at the top of those graphs in the middle of the 20th century. And then other nations are doing better and better and better and better, while Americans, on average, are falling farther and farther behind. So while we're still living longer in the US than we used to, we're falling farther and farther behind other nations. And part of what that suggests to me, one other point I want to make on that, and that's that when you look at the health of Americans at different income levels or different education levels compared to their counterparts in Europe, Americans tend to do worse. Even the rich Americans do worse than the rich Europeans. So there's definitely something going on in American society that is less healthy for everyone. And I think one of the potential candidates for that, of course it's hard to tell exactly what that is, but I think certainly one of the potential candidates for that are the cultures that we have around work. In the US, I talked some about work for people with lower levels of education, and they're getting enough hours tends to be the problem, and getting hours that are stable. For people with more education, the problem tends to be too many hours. And so we have, these incredible long hours working cultures that are clearly really bad for people's health. So I think we've kind of gone around the houses for international comparison, something's wrong in the US. Yes, probably there are things that are stressful and bad about the way that we organize work for people, even who have the advantages in the US.
Hi, my name is William. Thanks again for coming. So I think it seems like there's kind of a perception that there's like a limited number of jobs, especially for higher educated people, and that the perception is that for young people nowadays, if people are going to be working longer as they're older, like there's going to be fewer jobs for people who are higher educated, who are just entering the workforce. But based on your talk, it seems like more of the issue is that people, like employers, are making it harder both for people entering the labor force and people who are older. So my question is kind of, can we go back to the employee-employer relationship like it has been previously, or do you think we need new solutions based on how the market has changed and how employment has changed? And how do we get people across generational cohorts to like see eye to eye and like take on like employers and stuff?
So there's at least 3 really good questions, I think, packed in there. There's the question about, should we be worried about intergenerational conflict? If older people are working longer, does that mean less good stuff for the young folks? The second question, let me make sure I get all these. So that's the first question. The second question is, help me remember.
It's like, yeah, are old solutions like
Right.
from how it was previously, is that still applicable? Or no?
Could we just go back?
Yeah.
That's a terrific second question. And then the third question is, how do we get people to work together in their mutual self-interest to try to get something done about this? Those are all terrific questions, and I have none of the definitive answers. But on the first question about intergenerational conflict, My read on that is that there's very little evidence that making things worse for older people makes things better for younger people. There are obviously situations where there is only one job going and somebody's going to get it. And if an older person gets it, then a younger person won't, and vice versa. But overall, it doesn't seem to work that way. Overall, it seems to work that the societies that, and again, with international comparisons, the societies that do a better job of supporting older workers and retirement security are also those societies that are doing better by younger workers. And even if you think about a sort of medium level, like the level of an organization, very often you can sell more stuff if you have more good people working for you. And the problem is lack of talent. So if you can retain somebody who's old and skilled and then bring in a team that you build around them of younger workers, then actually you end up being able to sell more widgets than if you had gotten rid of the older workers. So it doesn't seem to me that we have very much evidence at all that intergenerational conflict is something we need to be worried about. Second question, can we just go back? No. And I'm not sure we would want to. In so many ways, if you could get in a time machine and go back to any point in prior history, but the punchline is that you have to stay there and you can't come back again. Should you get in the time machine? The answer is, for most people, no, you should not get in the time machine. There are lots and lots of things that are not good enough about what we're doing as a society right now, but there are many things that we are doing far better than we did in the past. Sometimes it's hard to hold both of those thoughts in mind at the same time. Things have got better, things are not good enough. But both of those things are true. So can we go back to old employment relationships? No. And what the solutions are going to be is still really very much up in the air. California's recent effort to change the employment relationship between Lyft and Uber drivers and many other people who are improperly classified as independent subcontractors and their employers is one really interesting effort that's going to be interesting to watch. And I think there are lots of other ways to cut that particular issue, but we just need to engage with it much more. At the moment, we have a situation where we just haven't engaged and updated the laws to try to cope with the ways that employment is structured. Third question. So the sort of political, zillion-dollar question, right? How do we, given that, I'm making an argument that the sorts of things I think we should do are good for everybody, how do we get everybody to be on board with me and all of us together and actually do something about it? I think there is hope in every election cycle. There are new things that people think of. There are new coalitions of people who band together. There are people who become politically engaged who were not politically engaged before. There are efforts to talk across the aisle. So I think, it's, in a sense, it's not profound, but we keep organizing, we keep working, we keep talking to each other, we keep trying to do research, we keep trying to find out what is true in the world and what is not. And we keep hoping.
Hi, Dr. Truesdale. I like that term. My name is Matt Gimsey, and Jackie and I had Beth with us on global semester in 1994-5, and her method of inquiry and questions and all were similar to what's going on right now, and so it's really wonderful to see you here, and we need to let you go before midnight, but I do say that for the last 50 years, I've had a career in teaching. And in a recent conversation with a friend, I said, well, I did not go into teaching with any ambitions for wealth or fame. And she said, that's worked out pretty well for you, hasn't it? My question is, our son has a career in the basement of his home, and he's on a team of online people who work all over the world. And the team of 20 people who are doing servicing of companies in their whatever they, well, that's as much as I can tell you about what he does, yeah, right. But this is a huge growing workforce of remote people who have no corporate interaction. They are online, they're distant, their bosses are somewhere, but not a direct sort of thing. But is this growing enormously, right? This remote thing? What do you think of that in the line of your inquiry?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So we talked about technology and the sort of perils of technology and being displaced by technology, but I didn't talk about all the good things that technology can do for workers. And one of those is to allow people to work wherever they are and to put together teams with the skills that you need from people who are based in many different locations. Technology also has really great promise in terms of helping people with disabilities of various sorts to be able to engage in the workforce. And in the last few years, we've seen a huge increase in the employment of people with disabilities in the US. And it doesn't seem to be entirely accounted for by just the tight labor market, though undoubtedly that's part of it. So I think there are certainly some things that are, I've given you some of the downsides that I see coming up, but there are certainly some of these really optimistic currents also.
Hi, thank you for coming. I really liked your talk. So I know you talked about this some in your lecture, but I wanted to go deeper into what you thought the effects of the growing corporatization of our workforce has on the aging society we live in.
So when you help me out a little bit more here, when you say growing corporatization, what are you thinking
So
of?
for example, Amazon is one of the biggest corporations in our society now, but just the way that corporations, and you talked about the Supreme Court earlier, and the way that the current Supreme Court, at least in the past 20 years, has really fought for the rights of corporations, Citizens United, et cetera, and how that has an effect on the way our society views the aging workforce.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think, so there's two kind of aspects of this that I worry about. One is some of the sorts of things that I talked about with fissuring, and certainly Amazon is part of that, where, for example, Amazon drivers are not Amazon employees. They are subcontracted typically. So if an Amazon driver runs over somebody, it is not Amazon's fault in law. And Amazon goes to great lengths to make sure that it's not their fault in law. And it's not always clear who is responsible legally. Now, I think there are things that are, if we want to talk about things that are positive, that could come out of that, there's a terrific book called The Fissured Workforce by David Weil, which I recommend, that talks about a lot of these issues in much more detail. And one of the things that seems like a real possibility is that these, the lead firms, things like Amazon or Lyft or Uber, they manage the work that they're not employees, that their subcontractors do in excruciating detail. So if you're an Amazon driver, you have an app that tells you where to go and where to drop things off, and you have to deliver 999 out of 1,000 packages on time. Huge detail that's required, and it's all technologically managed. But they don't build in things like no left turns. So there are things that you can do within even the system as it exists to say, okay, let's have Amazon drivers routed through routes that are less likely to run over pedestrians. doesn't take care of the problem entirely when something does go wrong, but it, gives you ways of actually improving health and safety through the same systems that already exist. So that's one part of it. The second piece, you talked about, Citizens United and the influence of, which I think I essentially take to be a question about the influence of money on politics. So in the last 30 or so years, and this is less about workforce and more about inequality in politics, but in the last 30 or so years, the share of income that goes to the top 1%, the top 0.1%, the top 0.01% has gone like this, huge increases, even as median wages, I think the number is something like, are $280 higher than they were 30 years ago. It's just flat as a flat. So we have this hugely increasing inequality at the top of the income distribution that took place at very much the same time as money became more important in politics. So we have a situation in which the people who are very, very rich and who are in many ways very politically active have a lot of influence. And I think that's a real concern and something that we as a society have to grapple with. Now, the vote still exists. If people do come together and pull together and say, look, we have demands. We, have things that would be good for all of us as a society. We would like to see these sorts of things. It's possible to get things done still.
So I think we have time for maybe one more question. And before we do that, I just wanted to make an announcement that as we finish up here tonight, our student associates for the Directors Council are going to be hosting, if you have not had your question answered or you want to continue to talk with Dr. Truesdale, you have the opportunity to do that over in the pause in the den for a little bit after this talk is done. And so is there a final question for Dr. Truesdale?
Yes, there are countries in the world that have a more luxurious social insurance system than the United States does, including earlier retirement ages, or at least earlier ages in which they can start collecting Social Security or the equivalent thereof. And I'm sure there must have been efforts to raise that age level in some of these countries. Do you have any information on how that's worked out?
Yeah, so certainly that's true. There are definitely, the working longer solution is something that a lot of other industrialized nations are pursuing too. So it was, I want to say, about a decade ago that in the UK, the retirement age was raised for men from 65 to 66, and I think for women from 60 to 66. So there have been some big jumps. Italy recently, I believe, raised retirement ages in the middle of their financial crisis very suddenly and caught a lot of people out who were sort of in between, like almost retired and then, oh my gosh, there's no pension. So that certainly is something that's happening around the world. And I think, is playing out in some of the same ways that we see here.
Okay. Well, on your way out, don't forget to drop off your comment cards with the students that are outside. And thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you to Dr. Truesdale.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure to be here.